Hello, everyone. I hope that you are all well. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Welcome to the Science Capital in Practice Foundations for the Future seminar. I am Max, one of the Science Museum Group Academy program leaders who has been working on this fantastic project. We have a jam-packed afternoon for you all with some really inspirational speakers. So after our welcomes, we will have talks on top tips for internal training, reaching new audiences, embedding science capital into everyday practice, as well as measuring success. There will be something for everybody today, so you will certainly leave today's event full of new and exciting ideas. We will be having a short break halfway through, as well as a dedicated question and answer session and some reflection time. If you can just move on to the next slide, thank you. We will be collecting questions as we go through each of the talks today using Slido. So to use Slido, go to the website slide.do in your device's browser and enter the code SCIP in all capitals into the code box. That will take you to a screen where you are able to submit questions. There is also the option to label your questions. So if it is about a specific talk, please do use that function. Now, throughout the event today, please keep checking back onto Slido as you will be able to view questions other people have submitted and vote for the ones you would like answered. This will help us make sure the most popular questions get answered. So please do get involved. Now we're going to stop sharing our slides now. So as we get started, I'm going to invite Karen Davies, who is our Head of Learning, Resources and Research at the Science Museum Group, to say a few words.
Thank you, Max. Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to be joining you today. I'm thrilled that the Science Museum Group and the Association for Science and Discovery Centres partnered together on this significant project, which involves 15 science centres and museums from across the UK. These centres used a science capital approach to invite a broader range of people into their organisations. They adopted an experimental approach and are now sharing those learnings at this seminar. This afternoon, you will be hearing about what we learned from applying science capital insights to our work and how you can implement it into your own practice. Everything which is shared comes from the great work done by all 15 centres. Each centre approached the project in their own unique way, creating a real mix of approaches, which include activities like working with a local deaf community, all the way to science at home activity boxes distributed during lockdown. There really is, as Max said, something for everyone. So whilst this event is a celebration of all that has been achieved, it is also an opportunity for you to reflect on how you can embed science capital into your work. Later, we will be giving you the space and time to reflect on what you have heard and any actions you might take forwards in your teams or organisations. I asked Sarita Godper, Director of People and Culture at the Science Museum Group, to say a few words to kickstart the seminar and share some of the work she is doing around diversity and inclusion across SMG. So Sarita, over to you.
Hi, and thank you so much, Karen. It's an absolute pleasure to be able to join this session today, and with such an impressive and diverse range of partner organisations. I've been reading about the breadth of activity that all the partners have been doing, which I'm sure we're going to hear more about today. And I have to say, I've found it absolutely fascinating to see the breadth of what's been achieved. I think it's fair to say for all of us, the past year has thrown up so many big issues into sharp focus. The grave financial impact of COVID on organisations, with many sadly fighting hard for survival, huge health and social inequalities that have been exacerbated by the pandemic, the murder of George Floyd, and the widespread global protests that followed, which have brought long overdue urgency for organisations to look critically at themselves in relation to diversity, equality and inclusion. So this is a really key moment for our sector as we work to make our institutions inclusive and equitable to all. I thought I'd tell you a little bit about SMG and how we're approaching this work here from the people and culture perspective. So we have a number of core values, and one of those is to be what we call open for all. And our science capital insights are really important in helping us to ensure that everything we do and how we do it has open for all at its core. And we are aiming for this value to be truly owned by all of our colleagues. This isn't just for the organisation to project this value. We all have to play a really important role in it. And so as part of our strategy, we have 4 key pillars: building an inclusive culture, growing a diverse workforce, creating spaces that are open for everyone, and engaging everyone with science. And of course, like any strategy, so much of the success to this is not just about what we say we do, but the actions and the behaviours that sit behind it. We want to commit to meaningful change, building on the positive foundations of Science Capital, both for our colleagues and for our visitors. And importantly, we want to be measured by our actions as much as by our words. It's been about 2 years since we first established our internal Open for All group to ensure that everyone, whether our colleagues or the millions of people who visit us at our sites or online, see our museums as places for them. And as Director of People and Culture, it's of course so important to me that we grow a diverse workforce. And clearly that's been more challenging for many organisations to achieve over the past year. And what the long-term impact of COVID on the labour market is going to be is yet to be seen. Some of the things that we are learning about and some of the predictions that we're seeing are of high volumes of workers switching occupations. So we're anticipating seeing people wanting to enter into new and different things and using their skills in a different way, as well as learning new skills. But also what people actually want in terms of work and what they want out of life. And we are expecting to see more changes in that regard. And so all of that presents us with some really interesting opportunities, I think, to think about how we think we diversify and start to plan and think differently about our workforces. What we do know is that we need to work much harder and we need to work collectively to reposition our employer brands, our sector brand, so that employment and careers in our organisations are perceived to be as attractive and credible as possible, and to be able to attract a much wider range of candidates. At SMG, as well as reviewing our overall approach to recruitment and selection, we're also developing a work opportunities strategy. So we're going to be examining all potential work-related interactions that could happen in a person's life. And that could be anything from careers education, work experience, volunteering, apprenticeships, entry-level roles, mid-career changes, senior career transitions, as well as advisory positions. And of course, as well as us seeking to create new opportunities, we've got to look at how we change what we do to recruit to existing ones. So we start to rethink the kinds of opportunities that we're creating. And at the same time, we know we've got to be so much more proactive in our careers education to showcase the breadth of opportunities within our sector. We have a huge range of careers and different types of roles that aren't always the first thing that people think about when they think of museums. And we've got to work to make that clearer. But importantly, we know we also need to really listen and understand from people what they want from work, what barriers they may perceive that we may not realise that we put up, and what people's perceptions of us as an employer or a potential employer really are. some of the things that I was really interested to read about were along some of these lines. So the Explore Science Discovery Centre, for example, have done a really interesting work experience programme aimed at young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, all with low science capital. And I think that's a really interesting model that we also would love to learn more about. I was also struck by the work that Science Oxford have done recently on a 6-week expert explainers programme to lower science capital local school children. And of course, much more from the really interesting and detailed reports. So there's an abundance of brilliant thinking and creativity here in this virtual room today. And I know that I'm personally looking forward to learning so much from your experiences. So all that's left to be said is that I hope you have a really enjoyable and productive afternoon, and please make the most of this brilliant cohort of partners. And I hope that we all continue to share and build on each other's work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarita. That really was great. And you're absolutely right. There is so much to learn from everyone in this room today. So I am now going to introduce Sharon Leverman, the CEO of the UK Association for Science and Discovery Centres. This is commonly referred to as the ASDC.
Thank you, Max, and a hugely warm welcome from ASDC to this seminar, Foundations for the Future. When we started the Science Capital in Practice programme, led by the Science Museum Group, coming to that training academy that some of you will have been there, where we were all so effortlessly close together at the Science Museum, it genuinely felt like we were part of something really special, bringing that whole area of robust research and providing the support to distill it down into what we can take to inform our practice and really action the report. And it was excellent. And I can't emphasize enough how valuable the work of the 15 science centres involved has been. Today, we can hear more about the stories of impact. At ASDC, we've seen how these principles of science capital have been taken and sort of spiraled into these beautiful, different, bespoke programs of change for each centre. So now I'm really excited to hear more. There is real sumptuous learning to be had. And at ASDC, I must say as well, we've been really privileged to work alongside you, Karen, and Max in particular, leading this work. So over to you for the rest of the seminar.
Thank you so much, Sharon. It's been wonderful working with you also. So we now have Nicole Molinari, my colleague here at the Academy and fellow Academy Programme Leader. Nicole is going to give everyone here a brief overview of the Science Capital in Practice programme.
Thank you so much, Max. Hello, everyone. I'm Nicole, and I worked alongside Max supporting the Science Capital in Practice program. So I'm going to give you an overview, as Max said, of the program to kind of contextualize some of the experiences and the practical tips that will be shared today. The program was a collaboration between the Science Museum Group and the ASDC. The vision was to create and foster a community of good practice that enables professionals to apply the science capital concept to their work so that more diverse audiences feel that science and science centres and museums are places for them. So museums and science centres across Britain applied to be part of the programme, which included a training academy, ongoing mentoring support, and a financial grant. We'll just pop the map up now so you can have a look at the spread. Thank you. So with 15 centres selected, the program kicked off in June 2019 with a 2-day training academy, bringing everyone together at the Science Museum in London to explore science capital research alongside Louise Archer of University College London and Heather King of King's College London, and start reflecting on the opportunities for change. Following this, partners had 15 months to develop and implement their ideas, whilst Max and the rest of the Science Museum Group team provided mentoring and support with visits, calls, regular newsletters, celebrating and sharing the ongoing work of the centres, and plenty of opportunities for evaluation and reflection. As an integral part of their participation, all the centres were asked to deliver science capital training within their own teams. The idea was that by incorporating understanding of the concept and its value into their organization at all levels, it would really help the program have long-term and sustainable value and benefit to their center. The Science Museum Group provided a range of tools and materials to help with the training, which of course participants could use and adapt to suit their needs. However, outside of this training requirement, partners were completely free to develop and refine their own projects, applying science capital informed good practice to plan an incredible range of activities, from providing work experience opportunities for unemployed young people to creating family science boxes, training staff to effect organizational change. Whatever the specifics of the projects were, everyone works towards this goal of making their spaces and offer as equitable as possible. The program was independently evaluated by an external researcher. The primary research consisted of video interviews with people from across the 15 partner organizations, and it also drew on data provided by the participants, such as their application forms, their final reports, interviews with some of their audiences and other partners. You will hear more about measuring success later on today. Of course, we all know what happened last year. So whilst some of the centers completed parts of the program pre-pandemic, many were forced to take their projects in different directions in response to sweeping lockdowns and restrictions, and indeed in response to their community's new and more pressing needs. True to their dedication and their spirit of innovation, they adapted to create meaningful, life-enhancing experiences that really helped their communities stay afloat during what can only be described as an immense struggle of a year. We are humbled by what everyone achieved in the face of these challenges. If you would like to find out more about what each partner specifically delivered, this is available in the Science Capital in Practice Foundations for the Future summary report, which we will share in the follow-up to today's seminar. So here we are now, celebrating achievements, recognizing challenges, and sharing some of the valuable learning that came of this program. We'll be hearing from some of our partners about their experiences and, importantly, practical advice for others interested in applying a science capital approach in their own work. There will also be a chance for Q&A after the talks. Keep in mind that today's speakers are also representing the other partner organizations, so some of what you'll hear may draw from collective experiences. While we don't have the chance to physically hear from every voice that took part, everyone was able to contribute to today. So thank you all for being here. And for our partners, it has been an incredible journey and an honor working with you. Thank you so much for sharing your learning with the wider community. Now back to you, Max.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, McCall. It certainly has been a really wonderful project to work on. Just a very quick reminder, please do get your questions in at Slido. Use the code SCIP in all capitals and submit your questions. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So we now have our first talk, top tips for internal training. This is going to be from Amy Boothroyd from the National Coal Mining Museum and Andrew Farrer from Cambridge Science Centre. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Max. Hello, everyone. My name is Amy Boothroyd. I'm a learning coordinator at the National Coal Mining Museum in Wakefield, West Yorkshire.
Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew. I'm the head of programs and delivery at Cambridge Science Centre, which is in Cambridge, surprisingly. Can we have the next slide, please? So we are doing our talk on top tips for internal training. And the first question might be, why do we need training at all? Why need it and who is it for? Well, it is actually for everyone. I think often when we're talking about science capital, because we are science centres or STEM related organisations, we focus on that science part. But the really key part is capital. Everyone in every organisation plays a role in how a visitor or a guest has an experience and interaction with that organisation. Anything from booking up to the actual science communicators. So we really do need to focus on bringing everyone on board. And if you do that, you also get an amazing array of insights from lots and lots of different areas, which you can use to make sure that every single person has a really special and unique experience of your organization. So in this talk, we're going to go through 3 sections. We're going to talk about buy-in, how to get your staff to buy in, confidence, staff confidence, and finally, implementation. What are the first steps after you have finished your internal training? So I'll hand over to Amy to talk about the first section, which is buy-in.
Thank you, Andrew. So in an ideal world, we want everybody in our organisation on board and trained within the Science Capital principles. And as you can see here, this is something that we've been doing within our museums and our training programmes. So we want people that are front-facing, but also people behind the scenes as well, putting forward a really positive approach to science engagement. If we can have the next slide, please. These are the things that we have got control over, so the things within our centres. So the information that we put forward in our social media, the way that we put together our website to hopefully put those positive aspects and to get people into our centres. If we can have the next slide, please. These, unfortunately, are the things that we don't have control over. People's past experiences within science. We don't know whether people have got a high science capital or a low science capital, what their experiences are with work and school and their friends and family as well. But hopefully by putting forward positive science engagement within our museum, we can get people through the doors. If we can have the next slide, please. So hopefully we're wanting this to be a circular motion, so people come to the museum, have positive experiences within science engagement, and then hopefully they will want to come back to our centre, and this is a really good way to get buy-in for training programmes within SLT as well, showing that we could potentially get more people coming through the doors and returning. If we can have the next slide, please. So during the training sessions themselves, it was really important to have buy-in, not from just SLT to get to the training sessions themselves, but also from the participants coming along to the training as well. Some of the people coming along had a fixed mindset on science. So we don't have science in the title of our centre. A lot of people don't have science in their job roles. So we have people with fixed mindsets saying, oh, I can't do science. Science isn't for me. I was no good at it at school. So to help break down those barriers, we try to tap into people's emotional connection with science. So we used the bag analogy of what's in your bag, what hobbies are in there. The participants could then see that some of their hobbies did have science elements, and also looking at the science aspects of people's job roles as well. And then as soon as people started to understand that actually there is a lot of the wealth of science within our centre and their hobbies and their job role, people started to take ownership of the training then. If we can go to the next slide, please. So confidence is a very big thing with bringing in sort of the training, some new training into an approach into a centre as well. So the one thing that we try to do is just create a safe space. So lovely teas and coffees, sweet treats, so people could feel really nice and comfortable and have open discussions throughout as well. We also try to simplify terminology, so not to alienate people, and as well as providing that safe space. But we also looked at examples of where we were already doing science engagement really well, so people didn't feel like we were starting at square one. We weren't trying to reinvent the wheel, celebrating what we already do, but then looking at ways that we could build upon that, so people didn't feel like it was going to take up a huge amount of their busy schedules. So I'm now going to just hand over to Andrew, that's going to talk about implementation.
Thank you, Amy. Yeah, so implementation is a key part of the training, because we don't want these two things to be completely distinct. We don't want training and then people to go back into their day-to-day lives and not be able to see how that was connected. And ultimately, what we're hoping for is a kind of blurred line between training and implementation, where people are constantly learning by reflecting back on what they have done. And we need to make it, as I say, linked to that day-to-day. As Amy said, introducing Science Capital doesn't mean that you have to completely overhaul your system. All of the people who work in your organization, who have been working on their specific areas, have been focused on how to make that work as best it can. What we're doing here is about bringing everything together, linking the experiences together to make that best experience for your guests. But the key really is to do something, take an action once the training is over, so it doesn't feel like it just drifts away. And that can be a very small or simple thing. So if we could have the next slide, please. This is an example of a reflective diary that we've been using at Cambridge Science Centre since we've been discussing Science Capital. It's a very simple Google form, which is free to use. And the fact that we've done it online means that when our staff are out and about, because we do outreach outside of our centre, people can access it on their phones, or they can just go back to their desks and sit down. We record some key information on here about what the session was, its date, and things like that, so that people can check back. But its real function is for people to record their thoughts and feelings about how that session went. And the key part here is that this is not for any of their line managers to look at. It's purely for their own personal reflection. They get time to fill it in, and then they get time later to look back over it. The line managers will then question people about how things have been going, with the expectations and the requests that people will use what they've recorded in their reflective diary to be able to report back. And thus they should be able to see an overarching pattern of what's happening, but they won't look at it themselves. It's a personal document. This has been particularly powerful for a recent project that we've done at Cambridge, which has been a very open-ended format. And the communicator who was leading on this was quite nervous about going in without the formalized script and having to respond to the audience much more free-form. But we found that by giving her the time to fill in her reflective diary and to reflect on it over time, she actually gained a great deal of confidence throughout the 8 sessions we ran, and now is much more open to just having free chats with our audience, and therefore being able to bring in more elements of the Science Capital principle. We go back to the next slide, please. The key thing is building momentum and realizing that this is going to take time. Don't expect results immediately. Allow people a chance to bed in on the training that you've given them and to get used to applying it to their everyday practice. But if you can keep that momentum going by referring to Science Capital in your meetings and asking them to report back and to apply it to decisions that are made, you can really get everyone really engaged and on board with applying Science Capital in every part of the organisation. We'll go to the next slide, please. So to summarise what we've spoken about in this talk, this is not a reinvention of the wheel. You're already doing so many things that are part of Science Capital. Really use Science Capital as a framework to start to look at them in a slightly different light, from a slightly different angle, and see how you can interconnect them even more than you already are. It's relevant, and it's about making great experiences for your audience. So it really is about your audience as much as it is about you and feeling comfortable with them. And just do one thing at a time. It might seem like a very large document, or when you first open it, with lots of theory behind it, but just take one small step, keep going, and you'll find that your staff really do start to take ownership of it. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you from Amy and I, and we'll answer any questions later.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Amy and Andrew. That was really insightful. I really loved how you picked up on the fact that you want to create a series of pleasant experiences. I really think that is at the core of Science Capital in practice. So as you can see on the slide, remember, if you've got a question, please go to Slido and enter the code SCIP in all caps. If you have a question specific to this talk, then please label it with top tips for internal training. Now, we are going to turn our attention to how we can start reaching new audiences. So let me introduce Kat Kelly and Emily Fisk from Science Oxford.
Hi everyone, I am Kat Kelly. I am the Science Oxford Centre Manager here at Science Oxford Centre in Headington, and I'll let Emily introduce herself as well.
Hi, yeah, so I work with Kat at the Science Oxford Centre, so I'm the Centre Officer.
So our talk today is on reaching new audiences. And if we can go to our first slide, please. So first of all, we thought we'd talk about why should we reach new audiences? Why do we even do it, and who can they be? So there's a few different reasons why we might want to reach new audiences. One being, of course, science centres are businesses and we always want to get new people through the door, but actually some of the perhaps more important to everyone here today reasons are to increase the science capital of our citizens. So getting people through the door and actually engaging with science is a really great step to increasing science capital, and it helps us to do a better job of serving our mission, so achieving our goals and deepening the impact that we strive to have by having these science centres. So science and innovation makes and sustains our modern society. It's got the power to change the way we live our lives and is integral to the future. By growing science capital in individuals and society, we can help more people to see science as an important part of their lives and culture. Getting people through the doors of a science centre and feeling comfortable in that environment makes them feel like science is something for them. This can encourage people to pursue science qualifications, lead into STEM careers, or just to engage more with science in their daily lives. So thinking about who can be a new audience. Often in this sector, we want to try and target underrepresented audiences. That might be a term that we use quite often. But what does that mean? Really, anyone who doesn't usually come to a science centre and hasn't been there before can be a new audience. So thinking in terms of science capital, people that don't often do something like that, it could be anyone. It could be that their interests are more geared towards sports or arts or music. It could be a youth group, for example. Lots of people have worked with Scouts or Brownies who don't necessarily have a science interest, but they might be doing a topic, or it's just a way to get young children through the door. And of course, what's challenging here is choosing where to start. So knowing if you do really want to reach out to people where you can have the most impact, then if you haven't interacted with those audience before, that can be difficult. And then sort of picking your battles, like where do you even start? Who needs us? So there are some ways to think about who might need us the most. So as I said before, the term underrepresented audiences can have many meanings. So can terms like diverse and disadvantaged. So we've summarised 4 audiences that could be a good place to start. So one of them is students from specific socio-economic backgrounds who are underrepresented in STEM. So that's both in their school qualifications and STEM careers. Also looking at specific ethnic backgrounds, so people who are underrepresented in STEM from that avenue as well. People of all ages and families who don't usually engage with STEM and who would have low science capital. So sometimes that's about just reaching out in your local area, so geographically local, and trying to reach out to different community groups or people that just come together for some other reason that has nothing to do with science and getting them through the door. And then finally, our 4th one as a suggestion is girls in physics and engineering. Next slide, please.
Okay, so once you've identified who your new audience might be, you might then want to think about the approach you're going to take to try and interact or engage with them. So as a collective, we've kind of broken this down into 3 key recommendations. The first one being be patient, carve out time and space. So working with new audiences or new partners can take time. So expect longer timescales than you usually would do for other projects, and be sure to block out that time right at the beginning of the kind of proposal or your initial schedule for this kind of work, because often it's not the kind of thing that you can kind of dip in and out of or squeeze into all your other commitments. So make sure you schedule in plenty of time. And also remember that you need to give your partners or your new audience time to think and process. So give them time to maybe feedback to their own team before they come back to you. Because remember that these kind of groups or these kind of new audiences are often stretched for time and resources just like us. So make sure you not only give yourself and your team time to think and respond, but also your new partner. By giving them that time and space, you're going to allow your kind of self and your partner to build a bit more trust. So just don't try and rush it. Second of all, it should be a 2-way process. So right from the get-go, recommend being open and honest to your new partner or your new audience about your intentions. So why exactly do you want to work with them, and what is it that you might want to learn from them too? They won't expect you to come with everything, but they'll appreciate that you've opened up that dialogue and that you're happy to be kind of listening to them. And sometimes also some new audiences have no idea what a science centre has to offer. So it can be quite good for those initial interactions to maybe come with a sort of taster activity or a menu or kind of draft open-ended ideas that you can choose from to get that kind of relationship started and to be able to kind of shape together. And that kind of co-creation process can be difficult, but I mean, ultimately the best way to serve these new audiences is to open up that conversation, to listen to them and understand what their kind of wants and needs are. So as soon as you get that conversation open, things should hopefully go smoothly. And then third of all, it's not all about the science content. So particularly for that first visit, science isn't necessarily the most important thing. The most important thing I think we found is that making sure your audience have a positive and comfortable experience in a kind of sciencey space. And that's the kind of key thing for that first interaction. The science content and the kind of more sciencey ideas will come later, especially if you have repeat interactions. And there's been a really nice example of this from one of the partners in the project from Catalyst. So they've actually won the Chemical Industry Reputation Award for this recently. So they have a project called the Mind Lab. So they've partnered with the mental health charity Mind to host counselling sessions with accompanying science workshops. So they've essentially hosted Mind for the counselling sessions. And once the counselling session is over, participants can then take part in a science or STEM-based workshop that is kind of vaguely themed to the content of their counselling session. So for example, they had fight or flight counselling linked with forces and flying papercraft workshops. And they also had coping with changes and adapting to your environment, joined with an engineering smart materials workshop. So they've kind of vaguely linked those things, but the sessions basically gave the participants the opportunity to try out the new approaches that they learned during their counselling sessions. So maybe try out some new communication skills, team working, or just to try kind of something new that had a little bit of a kind of a science twang in there. Next slide, please. So the other thing that we've kind of collected together from all the science centres are the kind of major challenges working with a new audience or new kind of partner. So to kind of go over these, so the first one, overburdening yourself. So it's very much in the nature of the people in our industry, in the science sector, science centre sector, sorry, that we often find it difficult to say no, especially to new partnerships and new opportunities. And I think often we end up taking on a bit too much. But it might be kind of time we start to kind of think about doing fewer things, but doing them better. So it might say that you don't just necessarily say no, you say no right now, but yes to later or a better time. It might also be that you can talk to your team as well when you're putting in these proposals and when you're kind of getting the kind of early relationship with your new audience kind of going. Talk to your team, warn them and say, you know what, I've kind of looked at my schedule. I think this kind of time in a few months' time is going to be really busy. I'm going to need an extra set of hands. So just prepare your team and be honest with them and yourself about the time commitments and workload these kind of projects will need, and always add a bit more because you're going to need it. And then gauging success online can be quite difficult, especially now we've all gone kind of virtual. So you can try and get feedback forms done after events, but often people have found live communication during the events, like having breakout rooms or chat functions, work much better. From Science Oxford, we've actually used something called StreamYard that we found worked really, really well. So it's a kind of like a software you can use to stream to YouTube, but it allows you to highlight comments from a chat box and kind of show them up during the video kind of as a spotlight. But if you want to ask us about that, you can do later on. But yes, StreamYard we'd recommend from Science Oxford as a nice kind of interactive tool. Third of all, evaluation. So across all the centres, I think we'd all recommend that you try and integrate evaluation into your activities as much as you can. So don't leave it as an afterthought. That kind of meaningful interaction will take time to produce. So yeah, don't leave it to the very end. If you can integrate it into your activities, the better. And again, Science Oxford have a few kind of examples of this, kind of fun, nicely, easily integrated activities you could do as part of a standard visit to gather feedback. So we'll show you our email addresses shortly if you want to kind of ask us, or put it in the Q&A kind of chat. Another thing in terms of evaluation, so Andrew's just mentioned something similar from Cambridge, was to keep a journal or a reflection log. So whilst you can do some training, we'd also recommend doing it throughout a project or throughout a new kind of relationship with a community partner. They can initially be a bit of a brain dump of literally everything you kind of thought and felt about before, during, after that event. You can frame them with a few kind of key questions, but they're also really handy to look through in terms of progress. So as Andrew mentioned with that member of staff in Cambridge, it's quite nice to be able to measure your progress either personally or as a kind of whole project. Another thing about evaluation is that it can be quite handy to have an external evaluator. So this doesn't necessarily need to be external to your organisation, it can be external to the project. So often if you're both delivering and trying to obtain feedback for the same activity, I think a few of us have found that it's quite likely you may end up getting inflated or kind of misrepresentative feedback. So yeah, if you can get someone who's external to the project or external to the delivery team to come in and help evaluate, then that works really, really well. The fourth point here is time and admin heavy. I feel like this is a bit of, is what it says on the tin. But again, just make sure you leave extra time for all the extra things you're going to need to do. So for example, the risk assessments, photo permissions, event registration, feedback, funding reports, proposals, programming, Zoom invites, email communications, the lot. So yeah, always make sure you've got plenty of time to do those extra little bits. You think, oh, they'll just take 5 minutes. They never do they? So just make sure you kind of schedule that in and carve out the time that you're going to need. And then last of all, great interactions can mean fewer participants. So I know that a lot of kind of projects and a lot of funding, especially historically, have been focused on having huge numbers, but actually we're now starting to move towards engaging kind of fewer kind of participants in smaller groups. And it's so worth it for the richness of these interactions. And we really want to kind of encourage everyone to reinforce this to our funders so that they kind of understand how stronger and more meaningful these interactions are with the smaller audiences, and don't kind of feel like you have to inflate your numbers. Be kind of true to what's kind of happened, and tell them how much time and how many people it's actually involved, and don't feel like you have to kind of jam the numbers to make it fit. But yeah, if we can have the next slide, please.
So that is the end of our presentation. If there's anything we mentioned that you wanted to discuss further or any questions, then Emily and I's email is up on the screen there. But yeah, any questions, we'll take them a bit later on as well. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kat and Emily. That was brilliant. And there was so much useful information in that talk that people can take and use immediately. I really, I think you really hit the nail on the head about sort of overburdening yourself and not taking on too much, but perhaps saying yes later. I thought that was really good advice, and that will be so useful to so many of those attending today. So please don't forget to keep your questions coming in at Slido. We have had some brilliant ones come in already. So if you like the look of any that have already been suggested, then please do vote for them. So we are now going to give everyone just over a 10-minute break. We are going to be starting again at 5 to 3. So please go have a comfort break, grab yourself a drink, a snack, give your eyes a rest and stretch your legs. We will be restarting in just over 10 minutes at 5 to 3. Thank you very much. Fantastic. Hello again, everyone. I hope that you are all suitably refreshed. We are now into the second half of the Science Capital in Practice Foundations for the Future event. So we are just going to go over to the next slide now. So thank you very much. We are going to be introducing Costas Minas from Aberdeen Science Centre, Alison McLachlan from Glasgow Science Centre, and Sarah Lloyd from Oxford University Museum of Natural History. This trio are going to tell us about how they have embedded Science Capital into their everyday practice.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Max. I'm Costas from Aberdeen Science Centre, and I am here to talk about what we've learned from our successes and mistakes through our participation in the Science Capital in practice. Could we go to the next slide, please? So following the Science Capital in Practice Training Academy, we decided that a very important aspect of, or the most important next step for us would be that the whole team could share our visions and aspirations. As such, we decided that the best thing to do was to start by training our whole team. This ensured that all of us were starting from the same page when discussing Science Capital in practice. Each training session consisted of a small introduction to the theory of Science Capital, but the most important aspect was the practical applications. So, for example, we reviewed accessibility of all of our exhibits, how effective our signage was around the building, and other aspects like practical aspects like this. We found that the practical aspect was a very powerful in driving our message through. And it is worth mentioning that this training came at a very transitional period for Aberdeen Science Centre. And we found that as a result, our team got a lot closer together because we've invested time and energy to create a common language and also create some shared goals. Could we go to the next slide, please? In order to make it easier for everyone in our team to implement Science Capital in our daily practice, we introduced a daily challenge. So a Science Capital reflection point was added on each daily rota, and this made it a lot easier for us to focus on a single aspect of Science Capital, but also to have stories that we share at the end of the day. This was extremely powerful in order to get the team to try different tricks, but also to keep us being creative and also hopefully having some fun along the way. Could we go to the next slide, please? In order to strengthen our message to the team, the principles of Science Capital were also embedded in our peer review forms. And we found that this way, the individual observations were strengthened by peer conversations and learning from peers. More importantly, this ensured that ongoing conversations within our team would mean that everyone is constantly interrogating our practice and continuously developing. Could we go to the next slide, please? And last but not least, we also added Science Capital considerations in our reflective diaries. Since the introduction, reflections are now used as evidence for changing things. For example, like how a room is configured for a particular type of engagement. We found that this was a very powerful tool for improvement, and it really helped us being constructively critical of our operations. So, for example, every time someone asks, why should we do X like this, the only wrong answer that we can give is because we've always been doing it like this. So it has become a tool for continuous improvement. Next slide, please. So after all our hard work, are we happy with where we are? The short answer would be no. For anyone that might have visited our Facebook in the last few weeks, you might notice the same not inclusive graphics popping up in every post. And this happens even if the graphic does not necessarily match the message of the particular post. The reason for that is that, as you all know, the last year has been particularly challenging for all of us. So working from home meant that a few of our latest additions to the team could only be trained on the science capital theory, but not the practical aspect. Even with a few people not trained, I think the Facebook is a very loud kind of like advert that we noticed that our standards were slipping extremely fast and in a very obvious way. So this has now been noted, and we have refresher practical sessions for the members of staff that have not had the opportunity to be part of this. And this also means that we will be very heavily focused on the practical aspects of science capital in practice in the future. Last but not least, this is also showing us that implementing science capital in our practice is an ongoing process, and it has to be continuously evaluated and improved. At this point, I would like to thank you very much for listening, and I would like to pass the microphone to wonderful Alison.
Hello, thanks for that, Costas, and thanks, Maxwell. Hello, everybody. My name is Alison McLaughlin, and I'm a Community Learning and Development Coordinator at Glasgow Science Centre, where we have a new dedicated community space called the Bothy. We haven't actually been able to have any community groups in yet because of restrictions, but we're hopeful that's going to change pretty soon. It's a lovely space. My role involves engaging a wide range of communities and adults with science workshops and events at Glasgow Science Centre that are relevant to everyday life. And we deliver it and develop a range of STEM and environment related workshops, one of which is called Weather Folklore, Fact or Fiction, which offers an introduction to the science of weather and forecasting. And I'm going to use this as an example of one of the ways we're embedding science capital in our everyday practice at Glasgow Science Centre. Could I have the next slide, please? Thanks. So the science engagement reflection points are a really useful way to review and develop practice. We've used these engagement reflection points as part of staff conferences and staff training to highlight ways that the GSC team can increase science capital knowledge and incorporate points, the engagement reflection points, into our everyday practice. We've also created a flexible guide or a checklist for developing and reviewing resources to ensure inclusion of activities which encourage science engagement and build on people's science capital. Do I have the next slide, please? Yeah, so this is just an example of how we've kind of interpreted the engagement reflection points to make a kind of checklist that we would use when we're developing workshops. So, I mean, there's, it's pretty simple. There's the science engagement capital column. There's a space for exploring how the examples that from our workshops can reflect these engagement points, and a look at a way of looking at the resources that we use and how they might encourage the development of science capital as well. Could I have the next slide, please? So this is just, the example of actually what I used when we were developing the Weather Folklore, Fact or Fiction course. I just used the checklist to put in the types of activities that we would use in this workshop and to check that we were embedding as much science capital as possible into this, this activity. Could I have the next slide, please? Oh, sorry, sorry, the last slide. Sorry. So yeah, so just to kind of highlight some of the points from here, the slide shows ways we have used the guide to review this workshop. And so, for example, confidence and ownership, promoting science talk and everyday STEM reflection point examples could include starting where people are at and discussing and sharing meanings of weather and climate related terms, discussing the origin of weather folklore sayings that people may know of, like red sky at night or never cast a clout till May's out. That's a good Scottish one for you. And whether they think there is any scientific evidence to support these sayings or not. Asking people how they access weather information and for what purpose, which is that's personal to individuals. There's not really a right or wrong answer, and it encourages knowledge sharing. And examples of science knowledge and extending the experience reflection points could include sharing information from the Met Office. Met Office have got really great resources and great videos that we would use to build on and develop knowledge about the science involved in forecasting. We would offer activities that people could use to put their knowledge into practice at home. For example, developing a weather diary, so creating their own forecasts, and highlight further free weather-related learning courses like from the Open University, Open Learn, Watching the Weather. That's a really good course. Next slide now, please. So yeah, this slide just has some images relating to content in our weather folklore fact or fiction workshop. So using the checklist, we would aim to deliver a workshop that helps people feel welcome and confident to take part in the workshop. I like a joke, so I always quite like to use the Weatherstone slide to start with, just to help people feel comfortable. And we encourage participant-centered science engagement. So we're asking people, how they access information. We include discussion around people's own everyday experiences with weather. We promote shared ownership of content and shared learning. So there's flexible content which the participants help shape, and build STEM knowledge through science of forecasting, and broaden perceptions of people that are involved in STEM, and making connections with STEM topics in everyday life. So thank you, that's me.
Hello, my name's Sarah Lloyd, and I don't think you can see my picture. Is that right?
We can see you.
Okay.
All clear. Yeah.
I can't see myself. I'm head of learning at Oxford University Museum of Natural History. It's part of Oxford University, and if you go to the next slide, it gives you a flavour of the kinds of activities that we have and the kind of institution we are. So over the course of a year, we have more than 480 events, and a large number of those are for families. And it's giving people a way to engage with the objects in the collection. If the next slide shows the typical kind of things that we have in our museum collection, we're well known for our dinosaurs. In fact, we've got way more creepy crawlies than we have dinosaurs. But dinosaurs feature a lot. Not many people are aware of our connection with research. Being a university museum, we have lots of connections with research through our own research team. The next slide shows two members of our research team. Ricardo looks at insects in amber from over 40 million years ago, and Lauren looks at the evolution of vertebrate vision. The next slide shows another connection with university research in our exhibition programme. We currently have an exhibition called Meet the Future, which looks at the impact of the beef and dairy industry on people's health and on the environment. And this showcases the research of biologists, economists, and medics across the university. So we have lots of opportunities to work with early career researchers in our family programme. Our next slide shows the Super Science Saturday that we regularly run through the course of the museum, where the researchers come face to face with our visiting families. And we've used the Science Capital in Practice project to train our early career researchers. The reflection points on the next slide has been a really good starting point for sharing the main principles. It's really easy to audit the things we do, see which reflection points are commonly missed or commonly implemented, and provided a really good starting point to help people engage with the public in a more meaningful way. The next slide shows one of these events, and it enables researchers to take an everyday experience, encountering bubbles, for example. Lots of people enjoy that experience of playing with something very familiar as a starting point for building up scientific concepts. So out of the reflection points, thinking of everyday experiences that have lots of science content to explore. And then early last year, our face-to-face programme was put on hold, but the science reflection points were still important and useful for us engaging with people at home. The next slide shows activity packs that we were able to put together and extend this experience from the initial activity. So they were extending the experience and in promoting science talk. And as we progressed through this type of activity, we became more confident with the science capital approach, and we're using the language more successfully, and it enabled us to be more ambitious. In the next slide, it shows a version of the equity compass that we encountered on the training programme. And here you can see that science capital is just one aspect of many barriers to inclusive practice. Whose interests do we serve and how much time do we dedicate are just other factors that we consider, and it enabled us to have more meaningful conversations with other people in similar situations. So we fostered links with other groups, and we were able to join a group called Equity at Excite. The next slide shows that group, and this was a group of partners from science centres across Europe who were committed to the principle that science is for all, and they were really supportive in enabling us to think about other elements of how our organisation worked. The next slide shows some of the aspects we took in more detail, and we were able to put forward ideas for new projects to think about who we employ and the partnerships we make. The next slide shows an initiative we started this year as a consequence of our work with Science Capital in Practice, the Natural Science and Heritage Scheme, to get young people from disadvantaged backgrounds into our working environment and give them an experience which can extend over an extended period into their everyday lives at home. I suppose the bottom line is that more teams across the museum see the benefit of a science capital approach to engagement. It's not just the public engagement team anymore, but collection staff, research staff, and most importantly, our senior leadership team. Thank you very much for listening.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Costas, Alison and Sarah. Again, so much useful information there. And I think, you've really done a good job of sharing the breadth of how you have embedded science capital into everyday practice in the short, medium and long term. So again, final reminder, get your questions in at Slido. There have been lots of brilliant questions already asked, so please do vote for the ones that you would like to vote for. Question submissions will close shortly after the next section. So if you are still mulling over a question, please do get it in. So we are now going to have a look at how we might measure success. We have some familiar faces now. So we have Sharon Leverman from the ASDC, as well as Karen Davies and Chris Whitby from the Science Museum Group. These three are going to discuss approaches for measuring success.
Right. Hi, everyone. Really delighted to be talking to you today. And this is a really important topic. How do we know this project or program is actually working? How should we be measuring success? It is an important issue for internal and external stakeholders, including funders and end users. For external funders, which I'm just going to touch on, as Emily from Science Oxford mentioned earlier, the numbers of people reached is high on their agenda. And often it's unrealistic outcomes like more students will go on to have a career in science as a result. but clearly there are many factors involved in that whole sort of journey that a student might take, which includes their teachers, their schools, their parents and families. So we also know when working with excluded groups, and many people have already said this today, the numbers will be low. So putting what we discover from these projects with more disadvantaged groups into wider programming is maybe how we can scale up. Maybe this is a case to make. Applying a science capital informed approach in our work and building science capital in individuals and society is the starting point for this chat. So I don't know whether you want to say a few things first, Chris?
Yeah, I think that the interesting thing is I agree completely that a lot of the time we're asked, did this activity increase science capital, or, looking at that kind of big picture, as you were saying, about long-term ambitions, are they all going to become engineers? And I think the approach that we particularly take at the Science Museum Group is to kind of identify where the role that we play in that. And people have talked a bit about this today with the reflection points and those immediate interactions that we have, or engagement that audiences have with our offer, and just think about modifying what we do and what we're looking for in those moments as well, because the research itself obviously provides such a kind of rich and convincing argument about what the problems are and maybe what we're doing currently, how we're excluding people. So we think about measuring in the immediate term and just think about how that fits within the wider ecosystem. I believe that's a term we use a lot, of science engagement that people have, not thinking so much into the future, but thinking, is this moment now meaningful? Can I identify where that meaningful engagement is, and what does that mean for that person going forward, rather than trying to do these very lofty statements or lofty ambitions.
Great.
I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Sharon, would that
yeah, no, absolutely. And I do think we fall into the trap of promoting our metrics and our outputs, as Karen said, as Emily said, the numbers at our events, the numbers of people who came, we're asked by government to do this, we're asked by funders to do this. And it really and we all know that it really does mean very little in terms of measuring someone's inclusive experience, which is so much more important to address in terms of the challenges of broadening participation. So yeah, absolutely.
I also found it was really interesting. I mean, just from hearing some of the people talk today, how much they're trying to think about how they evaluate their programs and obviously improve their practice. So I think that's absolutely essential. One of the partners in the Science Capital in Practice program, Winchester Science Centre, keen, like we all are, to ensure that any evaluation adopted helps further all our missions. Really is to build science capital for all. Interestingly, they came up with a creative way to capture children's voices that didn't include a questionnaire. So this just is a very sort of small but quite creative approach that I kind of quite like, and I guess it's just to start to sort of build on where we are. And I think their example included children placing stickers on the petals of a large flower graphic containing a variety of science identity statements that reflected something about how those children saw themselves. So the statements included things like, I use science at home, I enjoy science at school, or whatever that statement might be. And families actually spent time talking to each other about those statements. And to me, it provided some feedback on who is coming through the centre's doors and is an indicator of how comfortable they feel about science. And then, if you find that actually everyone's very comfortable, then what do you do about that? And how do you invite those other audiences in and encourage them to come to your door? So it's an interesting idea which they're looking to adapt. So I think, there's a lot of creativity in the sector about how you capture, people's feedback, and then how do we use that successfully?
I would carry on, Chris.
And I was just going to say that also at the Science Museum group, one of the methods that we've taken is that we're very lucky in the sense that we have an audience research team and a visitor insight team. And one of the things that we worked with our visitor insight team, who does exit surveys, is to build what we've called the science engagement measures into that. So they are 7 questions that are put into all exit surveys and activities, which look kind of broadly and maybe slightly bluntly, but kind of an indication of the kind of science experience people are having. So looking at, did they enjoy it? Did they see it as relevant? Did they talk about it? So for everyone here, they're kind of very aligned with the dimensions of Science Capital. And they're just a starting block to see, with the people that are coming, what kind of experiences are they having, or are there areas in which they're relevant? Maybe is that not scoring as highly on agreement? So it provides a context to ask other questions of our activity if it's not working for our audiences. So it's a good example where we've embedded it in what we do, and there's that constant reflection, but it's not just a learning team either. It's they sit within the marketing team. So again, it's in everything that we do.
With a program that we're running called Explore Your Universe, which involves quite a few of the science centres on Science Capital in practice. It's exactly these sort of proxy measures for Science Capital, which we've been trying to put into our feedback form. So I have one here. Let me see. Look at this. So yeah, a little images, things like, do you feel connected to science, or do you feel comfortable in our science space? Are you on the comfortable chair, or are you on the little stool there? And I think although Science Capital itself is not an evaluation tool, right, there is actually a real sector-wide interest in pushing towards its application for our learning outcomes in evaluation, in measuring who we reach. And with our program, and I think Science Capital in practice as well, we're finding that the understanding of participation, whether people actually feel included and involved, is and this identity shift to actually feeling that science is for them is so often told is very powerfully in stories. It can't be told in sort of metrics, but there's a real big role and responsibility for a national program to be able to share those stories and share that learning and draw out those themes like your report has been doing, because then no longer it's one story, it's a national picture of the change in the way in which we need to measure our impact.
Yeah, and I think if we take a similar approach to this, then actually it's stronger, isn't it? Because otherwise you could evaluate in your various silos, that you're evaluating different things rather than something that kind of supports the sector going forward, saying, actually, if we're all doing this, if we're all trying to build science capital in individuals and society, or however that might look, that the kind of evaluation that we're all doing is kind of adding up towards something.
Yeah, and last October I was involved in some desk research. It was with the NCCPE and the BSA and supported by Louise Archer and others to produce a report for UKRI on audience monitoring. And it was very clear, the metrics were pretty uniform across the organisations, but we did see this high divergence in the questions about, the experiences and the behaviours. And again, the link to a person's science capital sort of emerged as a real potential and something for a more collaborative approach, as you say, Karen. I mean, it needs thought. We understand that not one shoe fits all, but there are actually some wonderful synergies and ambitions to a more collaborative, being more collaborative as a sector, I suppose, and also supporting the road towards becoming more internally diverse in our own demographics as well. So I mean, this could, this is certainly something that we should pick up and run with for the future, and potentially, I don't know if this is a point to mention a potential follow-up session from this with you, Chris and Karen.
Yeah.
So ASDC are hoping to bring back some of the Wednesday calls once a month and bring together communities of practice such as this one. And on the Wednesday the 6th at 2 p.m, I'll be joined by Karen and Chris to push this conversation deeper in terms of how do we measure our success, how do we measure our impact, informed by science capital in practice and the science capital approach.
I think just building on from that, I think the big thing in terms of evaluation and measuring success from our perspective that I think we've tried to change and is increasingly changing is this idea of just asking yourself, what are you trying to evaluate? There's so many things in the past that are kind of, you know, you can say people really enjoyed it, which obviously is important, but can you set outcomes that you're measuring that may be more equitable or linked towards a more equitable ambition? I know that's one of the axes on Oxford just showed the equity compass. And one of those things is about asking, like, what is it we're measuring and why? So who are we measuring it for as well? So can those outcomes be just much more placed towards the longer term identity of that person rather than just thinking about, you know, they learned something new, like what is that useful information for? What is that information going to lead to in the future? So you're measuring the now, but it has a long-term impact. Just thinking more about equitable outcomes, I would say, is what we're thinking for the future. So hopefully we'll have something more to say when it comes to 6th of October, but don't hold me to that right now.
Yeah, and I think it is it's definitely a longer conversation that we can have in this short time. So thank you all for your contributions. It's been really useful. October the 6th is sounds like a good date to be meeting up again and hearing from everyone else as well who are trying to struggle with how to measure success. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Sharon, Karen, and Chris. That was really wonderful. And as you said, you can definitely have a much longer conversation around how do you measure success than we possibly have time for. And I'm sure that we will get lots of queries about that session in October. So thank you very much, everyone who has submitted questions. McCall is going to ask those in a second. So although we are just about to close submissions for new questions, you can still vote for the questions you would like answered. So McCall, over to you.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Max. So now for our Q&A. It would be great if all our speakers could join us on screen. If you could please just pop your cameras on, and I'll let you do that. We have had some fantastic questions. Some have been voted for loads of times. You can see them on Slido right now. And what I'm going to do now is pull out some of the questions around each theme, and I'll pose them to you. So we'll see how many we can get through now in our 20 minutes or so. So let's start with this question. I'm actually going to combine two questions because they're the top most upvoted around top tips for internal training. So these are questions for Andrew and Amy. This question, one question says, reflective practice is a skill as well as a behavior. How did you upskill staff so that they were all confident in their ability to critically reflect on their practice? That's part one. And the other part is, how did you ensure, given how busy everyone is, that reflective practice became an integral part of each person's role and didn't fall down the priority list? So maybe we want to take it in two parts. One is, how did you upskill staff so that they were confident in their ability? Over to you, Andrew and Amy.
Cool. Shall I start, Amy?
Yeah, I can do a few.
I think in the terms of the upskilling, that can be tricky. It depends on whether you yourself are confident in how you can reflect on your own practice. I think a key thing is the time, is to give people that time and make sure that they keep doing it. And it might be a little bit of a, don't forget to do your reflective diary. Keep reminding them for a few weeks. And we certainly had it where people were like, oh, I don't know what to write. What does Andrew want to see in this? And it's like, Andrew doesn't want to see anything. Just keep going. And I think it kind of clicks for people after a while. And then again, in the meetings where they are bringing things up from them, make sure that you yourself are using science capital, or at least the theories behind it, when you're making decisions or justifying it. And I think Kostas made a really nice point in the third talk there, about if you're looking to change something, then the justification kind of comes from that. And it's going to take a little bit of time, but hopefully people will click. And if you do find any resources, just keep giving people nudges and moments and chance to speak with each other, and it will kind of all hopefully eventually feed into itself. you have anything to add, Amy?
I would say as well that rather than having sort of set meetings based on sort of reflection, because we didn't do the kind of personal reflection in our organisation, which is, it, you know, seems a shame, because I think if we do some more training, we probably will include that. But what we did is we actually in other meetings that we were having, sort of team meetings or whole staff meetings, we'd just sort of bring an open discussion forward about sort of positive things that people have done, you know, and I'd share things that I'd done and everybody did as well. So it almost became an open discussion that continued, you know, depending on, you know, different projects that we're working on as well. That's one thing that worked really well for us. And also just having, I sort of sought people out after the training. I know everyone's pushed for time, but if I was going to see somebody about something in particular anyway, I'd be like, oh, how are you getting on? Have you tried, you know, everyone had their own outcomes, you know, things that they wanted, targets that they wanted to do, and they'd written little things down. So I just have that open discussion with them, and it was just a continual dialogue. Is there anybody else that wants to add anything that they've maybe tried, or little tips? Pass over to you, Sharon.
Sorry, yeah, I was just going to say, in terms of, you know, the sort of senior management, actually, you know, I really feel that providing that space and time for the hard workers on the front line, you know, to take the time to step back and look at practice and look at what they're doing and talk to their community partner. It is such a powerful tool for change. You know, and it can just start with a very simple question, like, imagine you traveled yourself back in time to this morning. What one piece of advice would you have given yourself? You know, little things like that. But actually, I mean, I thought Costas also, I know you've done huge amounts of work on reflection, but you know, I also picked up something that you said about how training in theory but not in practice has really taken its toll during COVID. And I think, you know, when you're thinking about skilling up, and you know, it is the practice that drives the skills of reflective practice as well, and making sure that you provide space and time and say, this is as important, I think, this is as important as the engagement work that you're doing, is the reflective practice for your own change. I don't know, Kostas, you've done so much work on this. I didn't know if you wanted to bring in anything else from your huge experience in reflective practice.
Oh, no, absolutely. Again, we found that reflective practice was something that some of us was really good at doing beforehand, but now everyone is doing it. So having this shared kind of like aim and goal, and kind of like giving us space to have group reflections as well, it really strengthened the message. And now we're actually making a point of not making a change unless it's shown in a reflective diary that as a process, it will have some kind of like positive change. So we're using kind of like saying, we're almost using reflective diaries like logbooks if we were in a laboratory. So we're using the scientific process, and any progress that is made is based on the evidence that we've got already. And it really, really helps if you get a good buy-in from the top kind of like leadership team, because there is always a continuous push for people to kind of like make space and reflect and learn from it and grow.
I remembered, Costas, reading that at your centre you had the finance person filling in a reflective log, which is absolutely brilliant.
Thank you so much, Karen. And again, sorry, thank you so much. And the really important thing for us was to make sure that it is everyone's job. Science practical is absolutely everyone's job. And the Facebook kind of like example was a really eloquent result of me not having done my job properly, really, in terms of training my colleagues. So it is a marathon, not a sprint.
Yeah, so I think in terms of the busy question. Everyone's busy. I think Amy and Kostas, they've really covered it nicely. Don't add it on as an extra thing. Incorporate it into what's already happening. And if you're the person in charge of like figuring out the timelines on the rota, you know, usually it takes 20 minutes to pack up a show at the end. Now it takes 25-30 minutes, so they've got that time. Just plot it in there. I know that's easier said than done when you want to do as much as possible, but plot it in. That's the timeline it takes, and let people have that space.
Lovely, thank you. Really good, practical advice for that. So thank you all so much. Let's take a look at some of the other questions. We have one that it's been tagged around embedding science capital into practice. It can also be answered more broadly. It's what is one thing that you will continue doing? And what is one thing, so what is the one thing you have tried but decided to stop doing? So what will you keep doing, and one thing that you might put a halt to? So I'm directing this initially at Kostas, Alison, and Sarah, because you delivered on embedding, but certainly can be answered more broadly afterwards too.
Shall I start? I don't think I would stop doing anything. I just think it's choosing the right thing at the right time. And all the things we tried, they weren't that they didn't fit or weren't suitable. It's that they just didn't match that particular thing at that particular time. So there's a time and place for everything we tried, and we've just got to try and figure out the best match on all of those things.
I would like to completely agree with Sarah. I don't think there's anything that will particularly stop. If anything, we're going to start enhancing things. So, for example, reflective diaries now are becoming part of our employee performance review. So unless you show some willingness to learn from your practice and want to develop yourself, there will not be kind of like pathways available. So definitely we will enhance everything that we've already got.
Yeah, but I would just agree with that. I mean, I'd still be, looking at using, how we incorporate science capital into the development of our resources. Something I've been thinking about from other, from the content this afternoon is that we put science capital training on for all our staff at the Science Centre, but I think what I would add to that, I think would be useful to add to that, is the why. Why would be asking people to take this, because they're kind of, everyone has to do this training. It's part of, a suite of learning courses that new people and existing staff need to do. But I think looking at the why we would all be doing science capital is important to help embed and engage people with science capital.
Lovely, thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to add anything to this? Okay, let's have a look at some of our other questions. So, let's have one on reaching new audiences. So this is a question for Kat and Emily. I'm going to read it to you. Often, there's a couple that are similar, but we've combined them a little bit. Often projects hoping to reach new audiences are quite short term and therefore struggle to create lasting connections. Have you got any tips for how to support new audiences so that they feel that the centre is a place for them and feel able to visit outside of special projects?
Yeah, so I think initially this kind of depends on who your new audience is and what the barriers they might be facing in terms of coming to your centre. But I think you can probably take this two ways. And one way could be that when working with a new audience or a new community, you might want to do kind of what Catalyst have done. So their example of the Mind Lab, where they hosted something with the Mind mental health charity. You could work with that new audience or the new community to host events that are kind of theirs, but kind of incorporate a kind of STEM or sciencey aspect if you host it at your venue or by working with them to kind of create something there. So again, another kind of co-creation aspect to it. So yeah, work with them to host events that aren't necessarily all you. But another thing would be to obtain feedback and ideas as much as you can from that new audience. If it is a really short kind of timescale project, get as many ideas about kind of general kind of things you'd like to see in the centre, or themes or topics that they'd like to have, and implement them. So it makes them feel that they're actually suggesting stuff that is happening in the centre. It is a place that they want to go because they've given these suggestions. So allow opportunity for feedback and ideas from those new audiences and implement them, and make sure you find kind of gatekeepers or key contacts that you can speak to share that these things are happening. You've implemented the things they've suggested, and it'll make sure they feel like they want to come. It's their thing. They've designed it for you essentially. But I'd recommend those two ways. So either hosting something that is kind of theirs in your space, or giving them the chance to recommend things that you can then implement and will attract those new audiences for a specific kind of topic or thing.
I would add to that as well. We had some really good advice from some training that we did with a sort of leader on SEN kids and families coming to the centre, and something that they said is that often especially if you're developing something new, if you develop with those groups in mind first, it will inevitably be suitable for everyone else as well. So for example, if you are getting feedback from a group that you've worked with on a short time scale, next time you develop a new programme for your usual opening, for example, at the Science Oxford Centre, we open every Saturday to the public. So if we are going to have a special day where we do a certain type of programming, if you design that programming with the feedback from special groups in mind, it will also be suitable for the general public, and therefore you've got them in mind first, and then hopefully that makes your everyday offering more accessible for those groups, so that you start to get them coming on what you would consider a normal day, and it doesn't always have to be something that's special for them. So if you've got, for example, people who've got autistic children, it's great to hold an autistic day specifically, but maybe if the goal is to get them to just come along anyway because your centre is so supportive for those groups, then yeah, develop your programs and activities with those groups in mind first, and it will be suitable for everyone.
Thank you. Really good insights, Kat and Emily. So let's have a look at a question that's come in regarding measuring success. So this one is for Karen, Chris, and Sharon. Someone is asking, what metrics were used for evaluation?
Of the project, of the ASDC project?
I think that we can turn it first to you exactly of the project wider, and then perhaps if we have time we can ask other centers specifically, but I think that's where it's going, yeah.
So for the project evaluation, and Karen and Sharon do jump in at any time, but it was split into two ways. So there's one about, as you actually pointed out, Nicole, in your introduction, was looking at the kind of metrics of who was engaged with through the projects that the teams were running, and how did they engage with them. So that might be internal colleagues, delivering training. It might also be working with external groups, schools, broadly community groups, or those kinds of things. So there was those kind of like more numerical measures that were used, but there was also a process of evaluation that went on for the wider project. So the embedding of the approach, if you will, looking at the confidence, how people felt about understanding of the science capital theory, how they felt that had been embedded in their institution, and quite importantly anyway, and this links to another question I saw in the chat actually, about some of the challenges that were faced there. So each of those were kind of broken down into, so there was, the metrics were more about looking at people's comfort, their ability to implement it, and how they then felt that had an impact on the audience itself that they're working with. There is a theory of teaching that evaluating that method, and the name evades me. Karen will know the name, but we broadly use this idea of, like I say, the original training and how people responded to it, how they then were able to use it themselves, how their colleagues were able to use it, and then the impact on the audience itself. And within that, there was different ways of thinking about it. But that was for the actual ASDC project itself.
And what we were really trying to do through that project was to build a community of practice who were thinking really hard about how to be more inclusive and to invite different people into their environments. So it wasn't so much looking at the audience outcome for the visitor, even though each of the science centres were interested in that. It was very much about how do you build this community, and you know, how do you get everyone sort of thinking through what the implications of science capital means for them. And each of the centres had a very different starting point. So some people knew quite a lot about science capital and had been using it for a while, and other people were completely new starters. So we were really interested in how you know, wherever you began that journey, how it influenced you know, where you're going, really.
Perfect, thank you. Sharon, were you about to say anything? I was
going to say, I haven't got more to add. I wonder if Max wanted to answer anything about the specific metrics, but I do think this sort of golden goal of how these more embedded changes are catalyzed, you know, and you see, you know, it could be staff development, it could be cross-departmental EDI groups, it could be advisory groups from the community partners or the communities working, now having a voice at the higher level, you know, and how all these bigger changes come about through those series of smaller steps and smaller wins, and actually capturing that and recognizing that one project or one person can make a long-lasting difference in an organization is really good. We've been working with on a different project with Dr. Jen DeWitt, and she's been finding again through interviews, you know, and those sort of processes, that where practice is pushed slightly out of the comfort zone, that's when the scaffold of the organization has to adjust to support it, and that's where you start to get some really interesting structural shifts in an organization. And I think this project has sort of done that and really tried to capture those changes along the way.
I think that was interesting from the evaluation, actually, because we've been looking at our SMG, I'm talking about now, how we've embedded in and the work that we've been doing. And what's interesting, reflecting on what came out of this program, is that the challenges, the successes and the challenges from an organization's maybe got 5 people up to ours that's got over 1,000, I think it is. They're very, very, very similar. And that's the kind of strange thing. So it's the scale doesn't seem to be the challenge. There's some like just very particular points about embedding, and has come up a lot today about building confidence and demonstrating the impact, both how your job should change, and not should change, but how we might change our role, sorry, or what that kind of impact that might be. But yes, it's quite strange how so common the challenges were across, and the successes as well. So that's been really interesting as part of the process.
Great. Perfect. Thank you so much for answering that. I'm actually going to move on to one last question, because I realized that we are coming to the end of the session. I think this came in during the top tips for internal training, so it's directed at Amy and Andrew, but again, feel free to open it out to others as well if you feel like it. Have you encountered resistance to science capital in your training or in your organizations, and how have you addressed that?
We definitely encountered some resistance. I think especially with our centre being in our mission statement, it mentions about the rich history and nothing really about science. So when we initially invited people along to this science capital training, I think a lot of people were like, oh, well, you're telling us that we're doing our jobs wrong, and, you know, we don't have science, you know, I mean, we're not scientists and all this sort of stuff. And it was difficult, and I could understand where that was coming from. I could sympathise. And I think really what helped us was just starting off with a celebration of things that we're already doing really well, and that it wasn't that we were starting from scratch or telling anyone how to do the job. It was looking at what we're already doing, and then gradually, it has been a slow process, but it's sort of gradually sort of looking at that. And then having that open discussion has really helped. You know, I've got now members of staff coming up to me and been like, oh, I watched something that you were doing and maybe you could add this, or, you know, you could add that. And it's having that open dialogue. You know, in the latest exhibition that we've done, it was just like, oh, right, oh yeah, like thinking back to that science capital, could we have a question there instead of just preaching to people? Or so I do feel like, although it's been a really slow process, having those open discussions is actually a big triumph for us. But I mean, you know, we don't have science in the title, but our museum is rich in industrial heritage, which is very science rich and STEM rich. So it was just sort of, yeah, I think starting with that celebration really did help, because I think if we hadn't have done, it would have fallen flat on its face. I'm not gonna lie. I'm sure other people have got things they want to add to this, so I'll pass it on to somebody else. Andrew, have you got anything you want to add?
Yeah. So we do have science in our centre title and in some of our job descriptions. So, you know, you would think maybe it was a little bit easier, but we still had resistance, and you always do. There's something new, you know, even when you're going to your science communicators, you're sort of, the first reaction is, oh, here's a whole new massive thing. I'm going to have to change the way I do everything, the way I present. And yeah, I'm happy I've developed that. And so something we did in the very first session where we talked about it was actually go back through different science communication theories and teaching theories, back to the one that our founder, Chris Leonard, kind of the one that he sort of based our centre on, and then sort of walked it through and just sort of pointed out to people that science capital was a metric. You know, they calculated it based on these questionnaires, and then they sort of wanted to effectively predict how likely people were to want to go into science and STEM jobs, and found all the other things they were doing in life that kind of predicted that. And I think once you split a little bit what the metric is doing and then what the theory is, people start to see that, okay, I can take what I already know and start to apply it. Or I can see where this isn't just a brand new thing telling us how to completely restart everything. It's actually just built upon what's been there before. And that sort of makes it look a less threatening kind of massive obelisk in front of them they're going to have to circumvent. It just sort of, as I said in the talk, it gives them a framework of which to look at what they're doing rather than an entirely new way of doing it. And if you from there, you can broaden it out and show, you know, your finance people or your marketing people how the booking process for a ticket to come in, you know, is going to have a positive or negative impact on how someone is going to enjoy their time. Then it starts to spread out from the kind of core audience of communicators to the whole organization. Does anyone have anything else they'd like to add?
Very quickly, because we've come to the end of it. So if anyone has anything very pointed, we'll absolutely hear it.
I think the thing I would just add is building on what's been said about this idea of science capital's relationship with obviously like established best practice, because there is a challenge, I think, that a lot of people look at it. And it's not that you get resistance, but the way it's framed or presented, they go, oh, well, I'm kind of doing that. I make it relevant. I do all of these things. But the challenge is obviously we wouldn't have this problem of these people feeling excluded if the practice had always been equitable. So I think it's really finding space for people to critically be able to think about it and say, who am I making it relevant to? Who am I not making it relevant to? And just say, there is quite a big change that needs to happen, but I do agree with everyone that there is that kind of slow process, and accepting it will take a while as well, because that is a big challenge, I think, as all organizations, that we want kind of quick wins, or not quick wins is the wrong word, but we want things to change well because we want more people to engage with us. But actually, there is quite a deep problem about who feels excluded and who feels included. So that's the thing that comes up in terms of resistance mostly for us, this idea, oh, I already do this, when actually there must be a change that can take place.
I think that's a really good point, Chris, about change. We want change to happen quickly, but it seems to be that change that is deliberate and really thought through is change that will last. So I think that's where we're really going with this. Thank you all so much for your insights. Absolutely fantastic feedback, thoughts, tips, practical ideas. It's very appreciated. I know all of the attendees to today will also be appreciated that. And also thank you to all of those who submitted questions and for voting. There were a few questions we didn't get to cover, I'm afraid of time. But if they were about project specifics or anything absolutely burning, please do email us at smgacademy@sciencemuseum.ac.uk, and we will direct your questions to specific speakers who can, of course, get back to you. So thank you all so much. Speakers, feel free to turn your cameras off now as we move to reflection time.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Nicole, and all of the speakers. So now we have heard all of our talks and we have had lots of our questions answered. It is now time to reflect on what we have heard and think about how we can embed what we have learned today into our own practice. So this whole event is about laying down the foundations for the future and building upon the great work which has been done by these and all of the other centres in the Science Capital in Practice programme. It is now over to you to learn and continue with this work. Some of you may be in a position to try something big. Others may want to try something a little bit more modest. Big or small, we want you to make a pledge to try something that has resonated with you today. So for me, I will pledge to take a deeper look at the reflection points and focus on one at a time to really embed that into my practice. So for the final time today, we are going to head over to Slido, entering the code SCIP in all capitals and click on the poll tab in the top right-hand corner. You can submit your pledge anonymously, or you can choose to share your name and organization. We will collect these and share them in a visual way following today's event as a reminder of our commitment to being more welcoming and inclusive. You now have just over 2 minutes to reflect on how you can embed what you've learned today and submit your pledge. We are going to give you some quiet time now, just for 2 minutes, so that you can think about this and submit your pledge on Slido. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to reflect. I can see that we've had lots of pledges come through. Now, what we are going to do is we're going to collate these pledges and share them in the follow-up email. If you haven't had time to submit your pledge so far, we are going to keep that Slido open for the next 24 hours. So if inspiration strikes, please do log back in using exactly the same login code and submit your pledge. So we have just about come to the end of this brilliant seminar. I would like to thank each of our fantastic speakers for taking the time to tell us about their work. They have truly been inspirational, and I know they have certainly inspired me to take another look at my practice. I would like to thank our audience who are from across the UK and even the world. From the incredible pledges you have made, I know you will all continue to try and make science as open and accessible as possible. Your fantastic questions have really helped everyone get the most out of today's event. So, as already mentioned, we will be following up this event with an email, which will contain a link to the Science Capital in Practice publication, the pledges you have all made, as well as a link to the recording of this event. You can expect this in your inbox early next week. So if anyone has any questions in the meantime or would like to get in touch, please email us at smgacademy@sciencemuseum.ac.uk. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.